Good morning and welcome to the 8th season of Project 180's Strong Voices Lecture Series. We offer it once again in partnership with our very dear friends, the Boxer Diversity Initiative. I'm Barbara Richards, President, CEO, and founder of Project 180. This year we examined the intersection of addiction, trauma, and incarceration with implications for mental health and well-being. To help us understand this triad, we've brought Dr. Hank Brightman to be here with us today. We also have here as co-MC Harold Young, a new board member, fondly known to us as Dr. Harold, who will introduce our major sponsors. Harold?
Thank you, Barbara, for elevating my status in life, but good morning. We're grateful that you're all here and for the support of all of our generous sponsors, each of whom is essential to the presentation of this lecture series. Special mention goes to our presenting sponsors, the Breakers of Chains, the Koski Family Foundation, Palm Avenue Wealth Advisory Group at Raymond James, and Bank of America. Plus, we have the Game Changer sponsors, Gulf Coast Community Foundation, Wendy and Jim Cox, the Boxer Diversity Initiative, and Cadence Bank. Thank you all for your kind support for Project 180 and the Strong Voices series. Before we go any further, please take a moment to find the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in, "Hello, everyone." This is just a reminder as to where you will go to post any questions you may have for Dr. Brightman later on.
This season's topic has important implications for our community, for the criminal justice system, and hundreds of reentering men and women who come back every year from state prison or jail to the Minnesota area. As many of you know, I came to this work in the late 1990s as a teacher in the San Francisco County jail system. My classroom became a cauldron of intense learning and sharing that informs my work and my life today. Peppered among the many stories that my students shared were accounts of traumas they had experienced that led them to the disease of addiction and then the open doors of the criminal justice system. Abuse or assault, witnessing the murders or deaths of loved ones, the foster system, and cruelties behind the walls of prisons and jails.
To help us understand the phenomenon of trauma and the effects of incarceration upon a traumatized individual, Sheriff Hoffman will introduce Dr. Hank Brightman shortly. In the meantime, here's a short video about Project 180 from the perspective of our wonderful residents and first week out clients.
Hello, my name is Phil, and I just wanted to thank everybody that's made it possible. What I'm holding in my hand is a valid driver's license. I've been at Project 180 coming up on 2 weeks, and it's been made possible for this to happen today, and I'm just overexcited to have a driver's license again. I've got gainful employment, career opportunity that I started yesterday, a safe, sober place to live, and everything's been given to me to give me the best possible chance for success, and I'm just so grateful today. And this was a huge step of that, and to not have to look over to my shoulder and know that I'm valid, driver's license, insurance, everything in place, and I'm ready to continue to move forward. And I just wanted to thank all of you for your help, and most of all, your encouragement and your love. Thank you again.
Hi, my name is Kathy Heiler. I am now able to go and pay to receive my reinstated driver's license in the state of Florida. Without you, it couldn't have been done. So thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Travis, and I recently just got released from prison just a little over a week ago, and I didn't know anybody in Sarasota, and when I went to go check into my probation officer, they signed me up with Project 180, and so far they've helped me out with a lot of things and given me another chance at life. I've gotten a lot of new clothes and a new phone and any kind of food that I would like, and I go to AA meetings every day, and they help me get to them, and they help set up appointments and help me get to those appointments. thank you very much to Project 180 and everybody who supports it for giving me the things that I need and helping me with life.
I'd like to thank Ms. Emily and Ms. Barbara from Project 180 for helping me with the things that I needed when I moved to my new place. Just getting from incarceration has taught me how important it is to have supportive and positive people around you. And I just want to say thank you, and please extend it to other sisters or brothers who may need help after incarceration. Thank you.
How many of y'all have been to the bank with masks and gloves on in this day and age without going to jail for it? And no, I didn't get arrested for a robbery. I managed to open a bank account. Thanks.
Being a Project 180 resident or a client in our First Week Out program means that you have a warm blanket of people who care about you. Your most basic needs are taken care of, allowing you to focus on the thing that is the very most important and the greatest foundation stone you have, which is active recovery. It also means having hundreds of caring people who show their compassion by donating through this lecture series every year to help you thrive. Wendy Cox, a longtime Project 180 friend, is here to ask you to join her in supporting Project 180's good work and the men and women we serve who just need the basics to get started again. Wendy?
Thank you, Barbara. I'm Wendy Cox, and I've been following Project 180 for quite a while now. I've been a volunteer and financial supporter for the past 5 years, a member of their Founders Circle for the past 3, and soon I will be joining the board. Now, I know that some of you are considering making a donation to Project 180 for the first time, and others may be thinking about taking it up a notch. Let me just share a couple thoughts that might help you with this. So when I first learned about Project 180, I wondered if there was really a need for helping formerly incarcerated people.
Control. Oh, I already did that. That's as best as it goes.
I had lived here for over 15 years, and I had not seen one single formerly incarcerated person in Sarasota County. Not one. Well, it turns out these guys look just like everybody else, so you can't just look around and see the problem. You have to learn and understand it. That's why these lecture series are so helpful. Well, to further my understanding, Barbara invited me to tag along with their CEO group out to the DeSoto County Detention Center. It's a prison, and see their workforce education program in action. I couldn't believe it. The CEOs that she brought with her were so eager to have these soon to be released guys working for them. They were actually recruiting them. This is just one example of how Project 180 engages with the community. They connect business owners with people who need a job when they get out. Getting our community involved, that is important to me. More recently, I connected Project 180 with another nonprofit organization in town to start doing tax workshops for the guys in the house. And we also just last week did one for a group of women in the Sarasota County Jail who had a lot of questions about their taxes. This is part of their financial literacy program, and just one example of how they partner with other organizations. That's important to me too. Just this week, I called Barbara on her cell phone and said, "Hey, do you have a minute?" And she said, "Sure, I have you on speakerphone. I just picked up a guy at the bus stop who was just released. So he's here with me in the car, and we're going to register, and we're just talking, and I'm answering some of the questions he has." So when people are first released, they get a bus pass and are simply dropped off, standing there alone. Project 180 saw a need and they stepped in. That's important to me too. So involving the community, partnering with other organizations, acting on the needs of the people that they serve, 3 good reasons to support Project 180 today. Now, our keynote is going to be introduced next. So this is a good time to put this out there. We have a $10,000 match from the Johnston Family Fund at the Manatee Community Foundation. So this is a really good time to make a donation, and I hope you'll consider doing so. Any donation made at or after this lunch will be matched 1-to-1 up to $10,000. So a donation of $100 becomes $200. A donation of $1,000 becomes $2,000. It's very easy math. At Project 180, we always have a grand vision, and we'd like to meet this match by the end of our lecture today. How's that for grand? I hope you can help us achieve that goal. So here's how you can do it. You can just click on the chat icon anytime during the program to access the link to donate now. It won't throw you off the Zoom call if you do that, so you can do that at any time during the program, or you can go directly to our website and donate there, or mail a check. The address is on the site. So now let's get on with the show. Back to you, Harold.
Thank you, Wendy, and thanks to all of you who show your compassionate generosity to the men and women of Project 180. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Project 180 partner, Sarasota County Sheriff Kurt Hoffman, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Sheriff Hoffman is the 11th sheriff of Sarasota County. He began his law enforcement career as a deputy with the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office in 1989. He then served the Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto communities for more than 3 decades as both a prosecutor and as the general counsel for the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. During his tenure, he was promoted to captain, major, and colonel prior to winning the 2020 election to become our new mayor, our new sheriff. Sheriff Hoffman has a rich family history of service in both local and state law enforcement, as well as the U.S. military. He has a passion for the veteran community, his family, and his hometown. He and his wife, Terry, reside in Venice. Please welcome Sheriff Kurt A. Hoffman.
Harold, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody that's on the call today and for an opportunity to participate in this. I think it's important for law enforcement, particularly law enforcement leaders, to recognize the commitment that we can make to help you all be successful. And I noticed on the call today are some of the folks that do that in our jail facility. I think I saw Ernie and Selma, our treatment specialist, and Sergeant Henderson from the jail on the call there. And I just have to give kudos to the work that the men and women do in our Sarasota Correctional Facility to facilitate the programs, including Barbara's program, which we've been partnering with for over 5 years. So I'm just extremely proud of what we do in the jail. For those of you that don't know, we do have the first addiction recovery pod in the state of Florida. Sheriff Knight did that when he came into office as a part of our strategic plan. And we looked at kind of taking at that time for law enforcement, a little bit of an unconventional approach to incarceration and trying to help individuals. At that time, it was still very widely used incarceration as just what it was, incarceration, and not any kind of treatment or rehabilitation or looking at recidivism. We're trying to fundamentally help people on various levels. And I think we've come a long way, certainly here at the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. And I was proud to be part of that as Sheriff Knight's chief deputy. And now I get to continue and expand those programs in the jail. I just want to mention real quickly a few of those programs for those of you that don't know. In addition to the Addiction Recovery Pod, we have a CARE Pod that stands for Collaborative Approach to Reintegration Through Education. We, a few years ago, recently added a Veterans Pod. As was mentioned in my bio, I'm very committed to our veteran population, our homeless veterans, our veterans that are incarcerated. We can do so much more for those that have served their country. And the Veterans Pod has grouped those individuals together and allowed them to deal with issues from PTSD to just basic needs of veterans, reconnecting them to the VA and things like that. It's been very successful. And then obviously our reentry program, which many of you are familiar with, either have heard or have participated in. And that has helped individuals with job skills. We did several job fairs. I noticed how important that driver's license was in the video that Barbara shared. We actually brought the Flow bus in, the Florida Licensing on Wheels, to help people get driver's license. I can tell you as a former prosecutor, one of the biggest impediments to success for folks that have been incarcerated is that driver's license and not being able to get to and from appointments and probation and counseling and work and those kind of things. So I'm glad, from a law enforcement perspective, we've taken a whole different approach to driver's license and tried to help folks get those driver's license. So, and lastly, through the help of Gulf Coast Community Foundation, we created 2 navigator positions that will help folks transition once they get on the outside, much like Barbara does with her programming, whether it's finances, housing, medical appointments, a lot of the things that you saw in the video. And I'm proud to say that we've just got acknowledgement from Gulf Coast Community Foundation that they are going to fund those 2 positions for an additional year. I have the contract right over here on my desk. I'll be signing it after today's presentation. So I really appreciate the opportunity to highlight that and to be able to acknowledge the folks that work in the jail. And I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker today. And if I could just tell you a little bit about him, and then I want to just share a few of my personal comments when we get to the end of this impressive bio. Dr. Hank Brightman first spoke to our community through the C.J. Young Society of Sarasota. His fascinating academic and military background, unique approach, and expertise in trauma led Project 180 to select him as our keynote speaker today. Academically, Hank has a master's degree in criminal justice administration, holistic counseling, and holistic leadership, 2 certificates of advanced study in counseling, and a doctorate in educational administration and leadership from Seton Hall University. He is a certified clinical trauma professional and certified clinical hypnotherapist. For the past 7 years, Hank has maintained a part-time private trauma and wellness practice in Newport, Rhode Island, focused on applying a variety of holistic techniques to support client recovery. His primary approach combines Jungian, Gestalt, narrative, and expressive therapies with clinical hypnotherapy, physical fitness, and nutrition. In his Navy Reserve career, Commander Brightman serves as the commanding officer of the Navy Reserve Cryptologic Warfare Group in Massachusetts, and he'll explain that to you. He is currently a full professor and acting director of the Civilian Military Humanitarian Response Program at the United States Naval War College, and has served as an associate professor, and director of applied research and analysis in the War Gaming Department there. If you want to see Hank's full bio, you can please go to the blog page on Project 180's website and read all about that. So I just wanted to say, in speaking with Hank yesterday, Barbara and I had an opportunity to talk to him for a few minutes. And I think what you're going to hear today about trauma and frankly, the stigma of being in jail is right in line with what Hank and I were talking about on Wednesday when we got a chance to chat. If you have that driver's license, if you have those programs that help you get employment and bring dignity and remove that stigma and the trauma to some degree, then that's going to be helpful in your success. And that's what we talked about. So we're just very fortunate to have Dr. Brightman, and I think his comments today will dovetail in many ways into what we are doing in the jails. So without further ado, Dr. Brightman, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sheriff, very much. And thank you, Barbara. I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen here. Always interesting with technology to do that today. And we'll just wait until that actually projects. As it does, I'll just share with you how grateful I am to be with all of you. Really, this is an area that's near and dear to my heart. What you didn't hear in that bio is that my first love was always in the criminal justice arena, but predominantly on doing what we can to help support recovery, to help support the journey of those women and men who face challenges in their life. Let's see if this is actually going to project for us now. There we go. Oops. So What I'd also share with you is that I'm incredibly envious of all of you in Sarasota right now, especially you, Sheriff, because it's 30 degrees out up here in Newport right now with about a 15-knot headwind. So beautiful time to be down south and not up here in Newport. So really jealous there. I will also share with you that the views that I'll express with you today are my own. As you heard, I am a professor at the Naval War College. I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of this presentation momentarily. But of course, when I share this information with you today, I'm doing it in my own personal capacity, as opposed to doing that through the Department of Defense or the Department of the Navy or even the Naval War College. And if you're wondering, why would you have a professor from the Naval War College talking about any of these areas? Well, there's lots of reasons for that, but probably the most significant is the area of the college that I work in. As you heard in the introduction, I'm a professor in what's called HRP, which is our Civilian Military Humanitarian Response Program. So we're that part of the Naval War College located within the College of Maritime Operational Warfare that focuses on response to natural disasters and complex emergencies. So in other words, helping people in need. Often we think of those people in need as being folks that are not within the United States. They're other developing nations or other challenged parts of the world. But of course, as we've all seen with COVID and the way that's ravaged our own population, that need is just as great at home. And believe it or not, we are actively involved in doing research and supporting efforts in areas like food scarcity and trying to ensure that America's population has the things it needs to thrive and flourish during this challenging time. So with that, I'll share a little bit of a presentation with you. As I mentioned to the Sheriff and Barbara, I'm not a huge fan of PowerPoint. There was only one gentleman that I know that was even more just really viscerally opposed to PowerPoint, and that was the former Secretary of Defense, whose name was Chuck Hagel. You may remember him. And he was so averse to PowerPoint that he communicated that to all of us. And the way that was communicated to us was in a PowerPoint. So it's always ironic to see how PowerPoint just transcends everything we do. But I'll do my best to keep this as imagistic as I can, to focus on images and of course, create a container for a safe, robust discussion when we've concluded. So there's really 4 areas or waypoints that we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about the clinical aspects of trauma. We'll spend a little time going through the definitional aspects of trauma, just to make sure we're all speaking a common language. Then we'll get a little bit into the neurobiology of trauma and why that's important to understand what's actually going on in the brain and in the body physiologically, somatically, when we deal with trauma. And then transpersonally, when we think about trauma in a system, when we think about trauma as humans connect to other humans through, as what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, how does that trauma pervade and underscore everything that we do? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, lastly, we'll talk about that within the context and container of correctional settings and the challenges that corrections poses in terms of stigma and labeling for many of our folks who are really simply trying to move on with their lives and transcend the trauma that they may have faced prior. We will, of course, have some time for questions and discussion at the end, and I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. So beginning with some verbiage, and again, this is probably the most text-based of all the slides that I'll share with you, fortunately. I did want to ground our conversation in the language of DSM-5, which is the manual that we use to diagnose what we refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. But I want to make a few points before I do that. And the most important point that I want to make is that PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder is simply a way of categorizing forms of complex trauma, certain reactions to significant emotional events. And whether or not someone has been diagnosed with PTSD, trauma exists in all of our lives. And what I certainly don't want to do in going through this PTSD definition from the DSM with you and working with you there is create an experience where anyone thinks that their own trauma, just because it doesn't meet some of these markers or categories, isn't important or significant or worthy of honoring and resolving. So please take this as a personal, impassioned plea to make sure you understand that trauma is something that all of us experience, whether or not we meet a clinical diagnosis of trauma. But according to the DSM, you can see that there are some specific languaging pieces to a diagnosis of trauma, and that includes certain types of exposure, whether that's to an actual, perceived, or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. And a direct experience is often part of that. People who are actually subjected to that violence or that type of injury. Witnessing it as it's unfolding, of course, can be an example of that as well, or engaging with a family member or a close friend who may or may not have lost their life due to some type of a violent or accidental experience. What's also important to understand is that when we talk about PTSD, we're talking about that first person accounting or direct experience. We're not talking about watching violent media content or news coverage or those kinds of activities, unless someone worked in a profession where they specifically had to deal with that kind of violence as part of their job, perhaps as a news editor or someone working in that domain. And that's really important to understand, because what happened when they rewrote DSM-5 and we looked at the events of 9/11 is there was a lot of meaningful discussion and dialogue about whether all the images that many of us had been exposed to, and I was actually working at the time as a professor in the criminal justice department at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, right across from the World Trade Center, watching these events unfold, whether the media reporting was enough to create a diagnosis of PTSD. And the determination was no, that these are actually events that have to be experienced in the language of Gestalt therapy, that shared phenomenological event where people actually have to be connected to what's unfolding as opposed to simply watching it. But again, there are certainly traumas around watching these kinds of events. There have to be certain symptoms, more than one, generally speaking, for a PTSD diagnosis. And often those symptoms focus on things like intrusive distress, recurring or distressing types of dreams. And one that I really hasten to use is the term flashbacks. And I'll share why I really don't like the term flashbacks when we get into some of the neurobiology in just a little bit. But moving forward from there, there are some other elements of PTSD that are important to understand. And the ones that I'd really invite you to consider the most are those elements that focus on detachment, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, which means an unnatural response or level of stress to an event or a series of events. So if someone is hypervigilant, they may always be on guard or on watch, even when the conditions around them may not require that. An exaggerated startle response. Many veterans, as you probably know, have a lot of challenges with things like fireworks displays. And assuredly, fireworks displays in a neighborhood, let's say during the Independence Day holiday, when they don't know that those fireworks are going to go off, that can create a very hyper startle response within those individuals. Challenges with concentration or sleep disturbances are common as well. It's important to note that there are, of course, other things like ADD and ADHD that can be associated with concentration. And when we refer to sleep disturbances, we're not referring to things that are caused by alcohol or other substances, or even things like sleep apnea or obstructive sleep apnea, where there are other markers or conditions that may relate to that lack of sleep. So we're really talking about, are people having these challenges because of post-traumatic stress disorder? Now, focusing in, as I said, on some of those self-destructive behaviors, one of the things that we notice, many of us notice in the field of trauma and working to help resolve trauma in many individuals, is the co-occurring or comorbid incidence of substances. Often people will use substances as a way to try and dissociate from those very traumatic experiences that they can continue to be subjected to. So dissociation is a very real issue. Medication is often a way to dissociate from that, as are other self-destructive behaviors that I'll share with you in just a little bit. I always feel it's important to understand that when we talk about trauma, when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, it's more than just a diagnosis, because people are not just a diagnosis. We're people, and we can have a condition. We can experience cancer. We can experience another form of illness, but that doesn't mean that's who we are. It's a challenge that we're dealing with. And to share, again, the PTSD definition from the DSM, I wanted to just highlight and focus that we are people, and that a lot of the challenges that we have as people are things that by connecting to others and better understanding ourselves, we're able to help resolve. So a little bit of the biology now, because it's certainly important physiologically to understand what's going on with trauma in our bodies. And there are two main centers of the brain I'd invite you to think about when we're thinking about the issues of trauma and complex trauma: the amygdala and the hippocampus. And the reason that we focus on those is that they tend to align with areas of emotional response. Now, there are different ways when someone is experiencing complex trauma that they may respond emotionally. They may have a flat affect or no response, that true state of dissociation where they've moved away from the experience in their brain, or it may be an overreaction, a hypervigilance or a hyperstartle, as I mentioned in the symptoms a few minutes ago. What's important to understand is that the amygdala and the hippocampus are very much working differently in a person who has experienced trauma or post-traumatic stress than they would be in an individual who's not experienced those kinds of pronounced experiences. So I wanted to share a little bit of that with you and show you what that looks like in the brain. And this is really just, for me, a very powerful way of looking at what trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder does specifically in the human brain. On the left, you can see what we would consider a healthy brain. And you can see those two lobes down on the left and right side and the normal function of those lobes. When you look at an individual who has complex trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, you can see how those specific centers are not operating in a healthy way. That white indicates a slowing or decay of some of those areas. And what that basically means is they're not able to process the way a normal brain would. I'm going to give you some examples of what that means in a little bit better, for me, understandable way in just a moment. But when you look at the two images, you really can see how these two brains look different. And you can also see in the front, as we get into looking at the prefrontal cortex and the risk decision behaviors that individuals who experience complex trauma often face, how that area of the brain also tends to be slowed or otherwise incapable of processing decision-making in a way that's to the benefit of the person who's experiencing that trauma. So here's another way to look at it. And this is often when I'm working with folks, the way I like to explain it. On the left, you can see this superhighway, and hopefully this is a highway that is easy to navigate. It looks like GPS may have some challenges with it, but this is the human brain. This is all of our neurosynaptic processes working the way they're supposed to, our mirror neurons wiring and firing the way they're supposed to, and information moves across our brain to allow us to have appropriate responses to a given set of circumstances. On a more micro level, when you look at that center slide, you can see just a clear highway. Information can move between the left and right hemisphere of the brain in a way that is relatively smooth and comfortable. The challenge becomes, and hopefully you can see on the side here, the challenge becomes when our brain is incapable of doing that due to trauma. What happens is we create these potholes, and going back to that earlier slide, those white spots that you saw in the brain. When we have trauma in our brain, it precludes us from having those kinds of smooth neurosynaptic processes, that alignment of mirror neurons, which means that instead of trying to go from A to B following a superhighway, because of all those potholes, because of all those different types of challenges that we often will take back routes. So think of it this way. In Sarasota, if you're in a rush to get somewhere, you're probably going to take the major highway, right? But if that major highway is filled with potholes, now you're on back roads. And what could be a 20-minute drive or a 10-minute drive on a superhighway may take you an hour to 2 hours on a road that you have to keep going back road after back road, or as our GPS will tell us, recalculating and recalculating to the point of true annoyance. Sometimes I think that the GPS is actually annoyed with us based on the tone of that recalculating that it actually shares. And our brain does that too. Our brain, because of those annoyances of having to circuitously move from one hemisphere to the other, makes it challenging to process information cleanly, makes it challenging to respond appropriately to a given set of circumstances or the environment that we're in, makes it challenging for us simply to make the best decisions that we need to make in the moment. And of course, the more we dissociate, the more we use certain kinds of substances that could preclude that neurosynaptic firing between the left and right hemisphere of the brain, the more that process becomes challenged, the more that we don't make the appropriate decisions in a given set of circumstances. And as I said, there are lots of things that we do to dissociate. And unfortunately, for people who've experienced complex trauma, often those are things that are not healthy. For example, people will use medications. Now, a real quick story, if you're wondering why I actually am in this field as a Navy Reserve commander and as a professor at the War College, it goes back to the Iraq War and the Afghani conflict, when a number of my crew were going forward and working in detention centers, detaining operation centers in Iraq and Afghanistan. At the time, I was the commanding officer of a Naval Security Force unit located at Subbase New London in Connecticut. And a lot of my crews were coming back from these deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, working in these detention facilities, and they were coming back with lots of challenges. They were having difficulty sleeping at night. They were having a lot of the other kinds of markers that we talked about in the definition of PTSD. And unfortunately, at the time, what the Navy was doing, and it's certainly improved since then, was using mostly psychotropic interventions, or in English, providing or prescribing medications. And more often than not, because so many of these folks had difficulty sleeping, the preferred medication at the time was a benzodiazepine. You're probably familiar with Xanax and Ambien and some of the other benzodiazepines that are on the market. And the challenge with those is that while they will help you sleep, they're actually contraindicated for trauma because they'll lock you into a sleep. So you may even be experiencing trauma while you're dreaming, and you're unable to actually wake yourself or rouse yourself from that dream. Couple that with the fact that because of military requirements, when you're on a psychotropic medication like a benzodiazepine, you're not allowed to carry a weapon. If you're a master at arms, which is the units that I ran as a Naval Security Force commander, you can't carry a weapon, you can't do your job. So now you have this whole other secondary and tertiary challenge of stigmatization and professional growth on top of everything else. So I decided in that moment, I needed to go back to school and get some additional learning, as we like to say. And I used my GI Bill to go back and get master's degrees in the area of counseling and in the area of expressive and creative arts applications for those with trauma. So for me, there was a very personal connection to the work to try and preclude the use of things like benzodiazepines. Of course, alcohol is a great challenge. Many people will dissociate with alcohol, whether we're talking about those who've experienced trauma in the military or police officers, or anyone who's experienced some form of significant emotional event that would label them as having complex trauma. When we also talk about these kinds of dissociative mechanisms, we're talking about illicit drug use as well, and things beyond that, even things like pornography and overeating or junk food or anything that creates that dissociative mechanism that takes that individual out of that actual moment or experience so they don't have to feel that pain in the moment. Again, there's that challenge of, as we go down highways with more and more potholes and start taking back road after back road, the decisions we make could perhaps be worse and worse because that prefrontal cortex isn't operating in the way it needs to. So where does that bring us now? Well, that brings us into the world of Carl Jung and the idea of transpersonal support and transpersonal therapy. And some of you I know had an opportunity to speak with me and learn with me when I did some work on policing and the use of transpersonal psychology in policing earlier this summer. Jung's work is pervasive in any system, in any society, in any kind of a policy area where we need to explore how to improve the human condition. And I'm an ardent believer in that, because what Jung did is he studied patterns, and those patterns often formed around archetypes or different types of identities. And we'll talk about those archetypes or identities in just a moment. But those patterns are really what's important for us to understand, because much like when we looked at the patterns of trauma in the brain, understanding the pattern of our lives, our relationships, our interrelationships, and those intergenerational relationships that relate to trauma and who we are within these systems is important as well. So I said that archetypes are about an identity, and this is one example. This is from Gillette and Moore, from the work that they've done. Let's say we were talking about the archetype of a ruler. And when we looked at the archetype of that ruler, they have certain things that are their dominant archetype. And you may see some of those. They may be a strong leader. They may be able to make decisions easily. And then they also have a shadow side as well, the lesser developed side of that archetype that actually is the harmful or portion of the archetype that doesn't provide the kind of support that's necessary to be an effective ruler. In this case, they may be a cheat, or they may be a victim. So in every archetype, we have the stronger side of the archetype and the shadow side of the archetype. Why this matters for us when we talk about trauma in the world of corrections and in the world of incarceration really focuses on the archetypes that we tend to see the most. And the archetypes that we tend to see the most are those around strength that has been somehow watered down, hampered, or dissociated through some type of significant emotional event. So we had someone or have someone who may at their core be a warrior. But the challenge is that along with that desire to be a warrior, there have been events in their life, traumatic events in their life, that have now created an environment where they have to move away from those strengths that they have, that stronger side of the archetype, and those lesser developed sides, that shadow side, has become dominant within the archetype. So if you look at the images I have here, this is actually the image of Dis, D-I-S, or Disa, depending on which type of mythology you like to look at. And if you think of the word dis, you hear the word dis in everything we've been talking about today. Dissociation, dis-ease. Because this archetype, if you will, of strong dominance overscored by the shadow or lesser developed elements, is a big part of what many incarcerated persons face, is a big part of how their circumstances, which otherwise might have made them effective rulers or leaders or pillars of society, because of this shadow element, ended up dissociating in such a way that they're now incarcerated or facing other societal challenges. All of this occurs within a broader field. And as I said, Carl Jung talked about fields, and this is actually a morphic field. If you look at some of Sheldrake's work, he talks about morphic fields of energy. This isn't a drawing. This is an actual image of an archetypal field, of a field of energy or pattern of energy. And those circles that you see in the center, those circles are where energy tends to concentrate. And what we learn in the language of Jungian psychology is that at those centers where that archetype resides, often those archetypes repeat intergenerationally. So often we'll see people who are in circumstances where they are a particular identity, a particular archetype, such as Dis, as we talked about before, intergenerationally, their mother or father may have had that same Dis archetype. Their child may have that same Dis archetype. Their grandparents may have had that same Dis archetype. And the repetition of a pattern or an archetype over time is what we refer to in the language of Jungian psychology as a complex. And why this matters for us is until we can identify and resolve that trauma, that Dis, and remove or at least shed light on those shadow elements, these patterns will repeat over time again and again and again. So where does that leave us in the world of corrections? Well, all you need to do is look at this image from the former Joliet prison at Statesville, and you can see that much like those patterns that I shared with you, this is a pattern. And this is a pattern where each one of those cells has a Dis. Each one of those cells has an individual who's fighting their own demons, who's fighting their own challenges, but has no safe mechanism to try and resolve those. So at best, perhaps they're dissociating from the reality of the environment in which they're in. At worst, they're trying to find ways to dissociate using unhealthy mechanisms, and we shared some of those earlier in the presentation. This is a particularly interesting visualization for me because it's based on a concept that was developed by a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. And when you look at the Joliet Statesville prison, the belief was that if you had all of these cells, and these cells were basically under constant watch, what we call a panoptic vision, from the center of the guard tower, but the detainees, the folks in the cells, had no idea whether or not they were actually being watched in the moment. The belief was that they would act appropriately because of that. Of course, what we know is this is a traumatizing event as well, because these individuals are so continuously under fear of being monitored that actually creates dissociation as well. It creates a helplessness. It creates an inability to stay present in the moment. So fortunately, correctional facilities like this, we tend to not see quite as much in the world as we did, but we do certainly still see challenges like overcrowding in correctional facilities. And again, thinking of the individual offender who's currently incarcerated, that person, how do you come to a place of health and wellness when you have no clear ability to do so? At best, you're dissociating physiologically or spiritually in the moment because that's all you have. Your Dis is overriding and overarching in the environment that you're in. So what can we do about this? Well, what we need to do about this is figure out ways to help people rebuild those healthy neurosynaptic processes, those healthy mechanisms that then afford them the opportunity to grow and flourish and become members of society in that broader community. If you look on the left here, you can actually see an example of a neuron process. This is actually what it looks like when mirror neurons are firing appropriately in the human brain. And you can actually see on the right a visualization of those neurosynaptic processes between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. When the brain is properly lit up and all those highways are working the way they need to work, our goal needs to be to help those traumatized offenders get to this place. What we call it in the language of Jungian psychology is create individuation, create that balance of the archetype that breaks that complex that allows them to grow and flourish and thrive. to get to that place where they're able to navigate those highways, not just in their mind, not just in the decisions that they make that are healthy and affirmative and sustainable, but in their life outside of their mind, in their life in their community, in their life in their relationship with others, in their life with their relationships with their families. And that can only occur when we do the work to create safe opportunities for offenders to grow and flourish and resolve the areas of trauma that exist. There are some great ways to do that. You may recognize the guy on the left-hand side there and the guy on the lower right-hand side, because that's yours truly. What we're focusing on to heal neurosynaptically, what we're focusing on to preclude dissociation, to mitigate dis in that archetypal language, is anything that creates bilateral stimulation. And there's lots of ways to create bilateral stimulation. There's drumming. You may have heard of group drum circles before. There's expressive arts and imaging. There's running. There's obstacle course races. And yes, there's even education, because educating the mind creates those pathways, those neurosynaptic pathways that then open and expand and create broader opportunities. So these are all ways that we can control this. These are all ways that we can move beyond the traumatized offender to help them reintegrate into society and reintegrate into themselves and aspire to that individuation that I spoke of. It's interesting because before we started today, Dr. Harold made a really, really interesting point about the lighthouse. And I bit my lip because I didn't want to give away my ending when he did. But each offender, when they re-enter society, when they become part of our broader communities, which we should celebrate, each of them and each of you are a lighthouse. And only by shining those lights brightly for each other can we navigate a community and a culture across the challenging waters that we face, whether it's some type of a natural disaster or a challenge like we currently are seeing in COVID, or it's a broader communal challenge like climate change. Only by being those lighthouses, each and every one of us, shining those beacons to help each other, will we ever truly attain that really, really positive spirit and energy that the 180 Project aspires in each of us. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
First of all, Hank, that was one of the most amazing presentations we've ever had in our 8 years. Thank you so much. Full of information for all of us. And I'm sure everyone will agree with me that this was just almost even overwhelming. It was so wonderful. So I have a question for you before we get as we get the questions coming through in chat. As I mentioned earlier, I was a teacher in the San Francisco County Sheriff's Office in the jail system there. And one of the most important things for me was to try and establish a sense of trust with the men and women that I served. But the hypervigilance issue definitely got in the way. And I found that people were sort of maintaining this 360-degree sense of awareness. And that made it very difficult to have sort of a single pointed focus on the material at hand because I was teaching GED. So I know we have a lot of teachers in the here in the meeting today. Could you address that and maybe suggest some ways to create safe environments and explain that a little further, please?
Right. So it's a great question. By the way, if anyone is interested, I saw some questions come in, or requests, I should say, for my contact information on the final slide. Rebecca, if it's not too much trouble to just drop that in chat for folks, that may be easier, because I want to be able to see all of you. And when there's a slide up, that creates a barrier. As I said, I'm not a huge fan of PowerPoint to begin with. So that creates a challenge. To Barbara's question or comment, which is really, really important about hypervigilance and how do we create those safe environments for students, for others to really grow? Well, the first thing we have to do is create an awareness around what trauma is and why there is a need to create those places where people can feel safe. Because before people feel safe, if people don't feel safe, they can't transcend that hypervigilance. The other thing that we need to do is understand that every single one of us deals and responds with trauma in a different way. And what that means is that for me, my mechanism for dealing with trauma might be to listen to classical music. So that's the way that I can actually come, if you will, to a place of safety in that environment, where someone else needs absolute silence. So Barbara, to your point, the way to do that is to really create an environment where we start polling students or others in those environments to ask, what is it that you need to feel safe? What is it that you need to create an environment where you don't need to be hypervigilant? And I think that if we did that, if we polled people to ask them those questions, going to the work that the sheriff does, we could create pods, if you will, within different kinds of community settings. You might have a quiet pod, you might have a classical music pod, you might have a drum circle pod or an expressive arts pod, where people could gravitate based on their needs to feel safe and to move away from that hypervigilant state to a place where that safety actually occurs. Does that help to answer your question?
It does. It's wonderful. Thank you. Sheriff, if you have anything that you'd like to speak to.
I would actually, and Hank raises a good point there. And, you know, for those of you that have been in the jail and you're familiar with its design, the jail was basically built in the 70s, the 90s, and in 2000s. It's really 3 separate buildings. And the one problem that we run into there, Hank, is just the ergonomics of the design of the building. And I'm sure you're familiar, these are linear type jails, although we do have some pods in the newer section. Our hope is, and I actually had a meeting this morning about the surtax project to put a community reintegration center attached to our jail, as opposed to another linear traditional warehousing type facility. If we can get that facility, my goal is to have more dormitory style classroom environment, even if you will, for lack of a better phrase, college environment in there where it's conducive to learning, and we can have those breakout sessions. Unfortunately, the design of the jail right now just doesn't really allow that. So if that project goes through, and we believe we have enough room to be able to do it. So for all of you listening who care about these topics, a community reintegration facility project in a year or 2 down the road, please support that, because what Hank is talking about, we will be able to do. And that's one of the things we're trying to accomplish.
That's fantastic.
Wonderful. I'm not seeing a lot of questions in chat, but I have several. So I would actually be interested in knowing Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. What was the genesis of that?
Right. So Jeremy Bentham, English philosopher, really believed in a model of criminology where if we observe people all the time, if people know they're constantly being watched, they won't engage in criminal behavior. And while Bentham didn't design the Panopticon, well, I shouldn't say that. He designed it, but he never built it. The belief was that if people were constantly surveilled, they do the right thing. Well, we know in reality, and the sheriff certainly knows this, and I know this from my time in law enforcement with the Department of the Interior and with the Secret Service, people, even if watched, don't always do the right thing. Eventually they become numb to, if you will, that surveillance state. Or some people just, they're not at a place because of their prefrontal cortex to make the best decisions that they need to make. I take a country like France, and you can take an area like Paris, which is among the most surveilled areas of any place in the world. But crime still occurs in Paris, right? And crime occurs for lots of reasons, but crime tends to occur where that gap is greatest between extreme poverty and extreme wealth, at least property crime and some of those types of crimes. So what's important to understand is even if you create this kind of a surveillance model, this panoptic model, which by the way is also why we have something called the Inspector General's Act that looks for waste, fraud, and abuse in federal programs, and that was created in 1978. The reason that we have these kinds of beliefs that if people are not watched, they'll engage in corrupt practices or engage in improper behavior. People still do. So it's a great model, but as Goethe once said, theory is green, but real life is gray. And that's the challenge that we tend to have in applying any of these philosophical constructs to a policy or to the design of a facility.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming up in chat, but I would like to ask you with regard to the design of, say, a pod facility, a pod in a facility. Isn't that sort of a watered down version of the panopticon?
I would defer to the sheriff for his wisdom and expertise, but my understanding when I look at things like Gottman and total institutions and some of the correctional research that I'm aware of is they're not talking about pods in the same way that Bentham was talking about these kind of panoptic models. Pods are more a communal model where people can come together and nurture and grow and share with each other based on a set of shared beliefs or values. Sheriff, did you have any thoughts or insights you wanted to share on that?
No, I would agree with that, Hank, except that, the pod definition, if you will, in a correctional setting, I think is even now aged. At the time that we were building those, we thought, wow, that's, have exactly what you mentioned, Hank, a communal atmosphere. But I think we've even moved past that into more classroom or these breakout rooms or even more individualized, if you will, in terms of the need for particular groups of inmates. You have 42 in a pod right now, and that's 42 in a pod, right? But would you like to have a breakout group for those that are artistic or those that are, suffering from a particular debilitation? Yes. So I think that gets you a little way there, but that podular design is probably somewhat antiquated, I guess, right now, the way we have it.
Great. We have a question here. Thanks, Sheriff. This is from Don. I'm curious about any relationship you've seen between the effects of trauma and its impact on self-worth. I suffered extreme trauma and incarceration, and for me, addressing my low self-worth was key in allowing me to feel safe and connected and worthy of reaching out for help. Does this seem to hold true generally?
What a powerful question and a powerful opportunity for me to share some thoughts on that. If you go back to the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder and some of the clinical markers for PTSD, a self-worth issue where people are continuously putting themselves down or engaging in negative self-talk or blaming themselves for traumatic circumstances for which they likely had nothing to do. Those are all actually part of the criteria for PTSD. So there are some ways that we work to try and resolve and address that. As you heard at the introduction, I do some work around narrative therapy. And a lot of what narrative therapy is about is trying to break down the false beliefs about self that have been reinforced over time through various experiences and replacing those with the reality, the true self, the person, the strong, confident person that we all are deep down and we choose to be. The issue that many of us have is that negative self-talk has existed for so long in many of us that it's become comfortable to kind of go to that place of negativity rather than a place of trying to transcend and ascend from it. And that's where the Jungian piece of this comes into play, where we try using Jungian approaches to identify those shadow elements of self. Because what I like to say is we can't change other people. We can't even really change ourselves. All we can do is change the awareness of our relationship between the archetype and its field. So once we understand who we are better and those things in us that are strong and those areas that are lesser developed, that affords us opportunities then to grow and change. Great question.
And brilliant response. Thank you. Here's another question. This is from Olivia. As director of the Sarasota Prisoner Outreach Project, we are connected with 229 inmates across the Florida prison system who are scheduled to return to Sarasota for probation at the end of their sentences. Many have expressed an interest in trauma and mental health assistance, I assume. Are there any materials that might be helpful for us to send to them?
I am a big believer in any kind of bilateral stimulation. So anything you can do that invites opportunities for processing between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, rebuilding those neurosynaptic processes are things that have value for us in healing trauma. So what I'd recommend are things like drumming circles, expressive arts programs, narrative writing or expressive writing, other kinds of programs that may be available in those modalities. If those modalities aren't available, there may be some that are a little bit more common, such as yoga, and there's something called trauma-informed or trauma cooperative yoga that can be very valuable for that because it forces people to connect to their bodies in a way that precludes dissociation. So that may be another outlet you may want to consider as well.
Thank you. We have time for this last question. This is from Jocelyn. Do you have a clinical practice? If so, what percentage of clients are currently incarcerated or have been incarcerated? Typically, behavioral counseling modalities are used with PTSD or have similar neurotypical opportunities. Jungian analysis is typically years long. Have you found a way to utilize a more typical Jungian therapy in a behavioral manner, or do you typically focus therapy via a Jungian optic?
Wow, these are just amazing questions. So I do have a very part-time clinical practice in Newport. That's very much a holistic practice. So as you heard at the opening, it's a combination of Jungian Gestalt, narrative, and expressive kinds of activities that are also combined with nutrition, diet, and as a personal trainer, physical wellness as well. To your kind of broader question, certainly traditional Jungian psychoanalytic work or even Freudian psychoanalytic work can be years long. What I tend to do is align the work that I'm doing with somatic work. So I use David Grand's brain spotting technique. I'll use EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I'll use clinical hypnotherapy for regression. So there's lots of different more neurosynaptic focused processes that I tend to do with clients that can be helpful. I will say I steer away, however, from behavioral approaches to dealing complex trauma. Many of us know that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has the lion's share right now of the psychotherapeutic market. It's what often, if people accept insurance, and I do not accept insurance, if some people accept insurance, which of course is important for many providers, they often are limited in the kinds of techniques that they can use with a client population based on those providers and the amount of time that they can spend with those particular clients in need. Often it's a 50-minute hour. In some cases, it's a 45-minute hour. Frankly, for me, trying to do anything that gets underneath trauma in 45 minutes is just, that's not viable for me. So I tend to do longer sessions. Those sessions usually are somewhere between an hour and 20 minutes. They combine a number of those different techniques that I've already mentioned. And because I tend to be dealing either with a single incident trauma or getting underneath the repetition of a pattern of trauma, believe it or not, it's usually 5 to 7 sessions. And after that, those clients may come back and see me for a tune-up, or if there's something going on in their life that they want to look at through an archetypal lens. But more often than not, it's not the kind of long-term psychoanalytic work that you might expect it would be in this field. Great question to ask.
We have one very quick, probably yes/no question. What about the presence of dogs? Can dogs help?
Well, dogs help everything. So I'll start with that. I'm a big dog fan and always have been. And certainly for a lot of combat veterans who have found dogs into their home and a way to help them with their healing, that's incredibly important. We all know that from a somatic perspective, simply petting a dog has been shown to be efficacious in lowering blood pressure, heart rate, And for those with trauma, precluding dissociation, because that tactile feel of petting a dog's fur or feeling its muzzle on your hand actually, in many cases, precludes dissociation. So I'm a huge believer in pet therapy, in equine therapy, and anything that creates those grounding experiences, to use the concept of the chakras. Anything that connects to those root or sacral chakras has value in helping preclude dissociation. Someone mentioned cats in the chat. I just happened to see that. Yes, I like cats too. I'm not anti-cat. I think that cats may have a cure for COVID, but they've chosen not to tell us that because they're cats. But I do like cats too, and certainly any living creature can have tremendous healing value for those experiencing trauma. And that, of course, is important, especially in the evenings when a person might be in a restful state and might otherwise experience some elevation or deviation from a normal sleep pattern. Having that heartbeat or that connection to another living being often will help preclude some of that.
Sorry, that was my timer, but we do have one really important question, and if we can keep it brief, we'll slip it in. In your opinion, how effective are the 12 steps in dealing with trauma?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, often a common form of dissociation is the use of alcohol or abuse of alcohol. And whether we're talking about the 12 steps through an alcohol program or a narcotics program or other substance, what you learn very quickly about the 12-step model is it has a lot of alliances and connections to Jung's work as well, particularly that belief in a spiritual or higher power, that belief in trying to unpack those false beliefs about self, the shadow element of self, which can only be expressed by connecting to others, and some of the penance and make amends that's done in the 12-step model. There, as I like to say, there are many pathways or roads to nirvana, and the 12-step program assuredly can be a way that connects not just to helping to heal trauma and creating that grounding, but to the broader collective field of psychotherapeutics as well.
Hank, thank you so very much. Sheriff, I'm going to ask you if you could direct your question to Dr. Brightman at a later time, if that would be okay. We do have to move on. Unfortunately, we could keep going with this for quite a long time, I know. And thank you all for your wonderful questions, everybody. So let's go back to you now, Harold, and we'll move on with the rest of our program. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Brightman.
Thank you, Hank, for your outstanding presentation on trauma and incarceration. And now we have a short video from our presenting sponsor, Bank of America. Here's Mike McCoy, President for Bank of America in Sarasota and Manatee.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike McCoy, President for Bank of America in Sarasota, Manatee. At Bank of America, we have a clear purpose to help make financial lives better through the power of every connection. Through our expertise and resources, we are committed to doing our part to help build thriving communities. Enhancing economic mobility for individuals and families is one key aspect of our approach. But we know we can't do it alone. And so we seek partnerships with organizations focused on workforce development, basic needs, and community development. We must all work together to help connect youth, individuals, and underserved communities with jobs and skills training through workforce development programs and partnerships. One of those partnerships is with Project 180 and their focus on second chance job skill training and academic education. We are proud to support their efforts today as a presenting sponsor of the Strong Voices, Strong Subjects lecture series. We believe that together we have the power to make a difference. Thank you.
Well, we'd like to say thanks so much to Bank of America and to you, Mike, and to your team, with special mention to Jamie Collins. We know how much you do in our community and appreciate it. And now we're going to go into our breakout rooms. So you should meet one of our residents in each room, and he will tell you a little bit about himself. Please watch for a prompt. It should be coming on your screen any moment. And after you arrive, please unmute and turn your video on. We'll see you in a few minutes. We're just so grateful that you could be here with us today to share your knowledge and expertise with our community. Sheriff, thank you so much. I'd like to also thank the Project 180 Board of Directors, our staff, Emily, who made that video that you saw earlier, and Mike, our house manager, all of our wonderful residents, and our partner, the Boxer Diversity Initiative, all of our sponsors, with special thanks to our presenting sponsors. And did I mention the Boxer Diversity Initiative? I think I did, but they deserve mention a second time. So we look forward to seeing you all again April 2nd with John Annis, who will moderate a panel discussion on trauma, addiction, and incarceration with local experts. And John Annis is the Vice President of Collaboration and Impact with the Charles and Marjorie Barancik Foundation, who are also wonderful friends of Project 180. We say thank you so much for being here today. We'll see you in a month, and have a lovely afternoon. Bye-bye.